That's sort of what all students do now, I think, isn't it? They do the Inca Trail, or they go to the Southeast Asia somewhere, and they generally pollute the outer reaches of the world until they've grown up. But I didn't do that. I wanted to emulate Paul Pennyfeather from Evelyn Waugh's Decline and Fall. I wanted a job as a prep school teacher. And maybe because I've been expelled from so many schools, I felt that it was my job really to prove to myself that I was no longer an outsider, that I was perhaps an insider for the last time in my life. And so I went to this extraordinary place in Piccadilly, in central London, called Gabbitas and Thring. Extraordinarily Dickensian name, but I promise you it exists. And Gabbitas and Thring, which reminds me, there was a fabulous, slightly queenie, Australian actor called Frank Thring, wasn't there? Yeah, probably, great man. I remember him in, wasn't he Pontius Pilate in Ben-Hur? Fabulous, fabulous figure. Am I wrong to call him slightly queenie? No, I don't know. Anyway, but he was the last of that generation of Australian actors who spoke in a more English accent than any Englishman who ever lived. Anyway, it's nice to be here on the stage of the Sydney Opera House, and remember Frank Thring. Frank, there you are. Good. So I went to Gabbitas and Thring and said that I wanted a job teaching as an assistant master in some sort of school if they could help out. And they said, oh, we'll put you in our books and we'll get back to you. So I took a train back to Norfolk, back to my parents' house, and 2 days later, my father said, phone call for you. And I picked up the phone, and they said, oh, jubilant news, young Mr. Fry. I said, what is it? They said, we have a very nice little prepper in North Yorkshire where the classics master, Mr. Kemp Welsh, slipped on the ice and has sustained a fracture to his pelvic girdle. I remember that phrase exactly, a pelvic girdle? Does anybody say pelvic girdle? But anyway, they did. And I said, gosh, North Yorkshire is quite a long way again by British terms. And they said, but no, happily, the father of the headmaster lives in Norfolk, and he will interview you for the post. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. So he gave me the address, and I bicycled over to this old rectory not far from where I lived. And there was a splendid old fellow who said, hello, come in. His name was Valentine, and a tremendous fellow, Mr. Valentine. I can't remember his first name. His son was Jeremy Valentine, was the headmaster of the school. He said, oh, lovely to see you, lovely to see you. Now, you've got a scholarship to Queen's, haven't you? He said, I'm trying to remember who the great cricketers who've ever been through Queen's College were. He said there was Oliver Popperwell, who was a very decent wicket-keeper batsman. I remember him. There must have been others in my time. He then went on talking about P.B.H. May, who played for England. And I eventually said, what sort of duties would be required as a teacher? He said, well, Latin and Greek, you sound on those? I said, immensely sound Latin and Greek. He said, probably a little history and some French, I think, and some of the other masters may want you to fill in with their subjects too, and refereeing perhaps some rugby. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know the first thing about rugby. And cricket. I said, cricket is good. He said, excellent. And you've got a scholarship. Queen's, very, very good. Very good. Excellent. Well, do give them all my best wishes, won't you? I said, what do you mean I've got the job? He said, oh, yes, you seem immensely sound. So that's how in those days you were given in charge of 100 or so young, impressionable minds. And I arrived the very next day at this school. It was an enormous parsonical master with his standing in front of the hearth, who said, it's our new classics bod. He said, hello. Ronnie Noakes, come and warm your ass by the fire. He said. And we had an exciting discussion about whether I preferred Thompson and Craddock or Kennedy in terms of Latin primers. And then the headmaster came in and said, excellent, good to see you. And the very first lesson the next day, he said, he said, Barry's a little unwell, so you're going to have to take his biology tomorrow morning. Said, biology? Oh, God, I imagined. At school, I remember cutting up frogs and all kinds of unpleasant things. I arrived the next morning at the chapel and the prayers, and I eventually tracked down the headmaster and I said, what am I supposed to be teaching this form? He said, "Oh, it's upper fifth. Upper fifth." He said, "Barry wrote a note for you, here it is." And I read it. He said, "Dear Mr. Fry, hope to meet you soon. Sorry I can't teach it. Upper fifth, they're very smart, don't worry, covering human reproduction." So that was my introduction to teaching, was human. It was a magnificent time, and it gave me some extraordinary insight into myself as much as anyone else. I don't know if any of you here are teachers, but I have to say, and I'm not saying this to crawl to you, but I have never in all my life done anything as hard, just in terms of tiring and exhausting and mind and body consuming as teaching. It is one of the most extraordinarily hard jobs you could ever do. Somehow your body gets used to it, but after the first 3 days I was very, very minded to run away. I didn't. I stayed the course, and in fact I continued to go back to that school to teach while I was at university. But that brings me on to another W, which is writing. Now, this is a very important one for me because writing is something I do all the time. There's I don't know if you're familiar with it, there's a marvellous Michael Powell film called The Red Shoes. And yes, it's one of the great films. He's one of the great directors, Michael Powell. There's a scene in it that means a great deal to me. It's quite corny in a way, but it's so perfectly done because it's Michael Powell, and written by Emmerich, of course, and Pressburger, Emmerich Pressburger. And there's Moira Shearer plays this young girl who's a ballet dancer. And there's a kind of Diaghilev figure, an entrepreneur, an impresario, I should say, played by the fabulous actor Anton Walbrook, who's one of my favourite film actors there ever was. And her mother takes her to an opera house, the Royal Opera House as it happens. The Sydney Opera House, quite simply, hadn't been built. And otherwise they would have used it, because it's better and more famous and bigger and just somehow less English and more Australian and wonderful, therefore. So, but anyway, she goes to see this ballet, and in the interval, there is this impresario played by Anton Walbrook, and the mother drags her up to him, taps him on the shoulder, and he turns around rather wearily, and she says, "I want to introduce my daughter, who's a magnificent young ballet dancer, and she should join your company. She wants to join your company." And he raises languid eyes and looks at her and says, "Why do you want to join my company?" She said, "Well, I've Moira Shearer," says the daughter. She says, I've heard it's really very good, and it's the best, I think. You're absolutely wonderful, and I like dancing, and I think it would be wonderful fun." And he just simply turns his back on her and walks away. And the mother goes, "Well," and drags her daughter back. Says, "What a rude man." But you can see she stands there, the daughter, Moira Shearer, absolutely fixed, and the camera moves in on her face. Her eyes are sparkling with, you can't tell what. Is it fury because he's been rude? It's something very big to her. And she goes up to him. She taps him on the shoulder this time, not her mother. And he turns around and then he looks really annoyed. "What?" He says, "I just want to say that I was wrong with what I told you. And I said I want to join your company because it's a good company. And I like to dance. It's not that I like to dance. I have to dance. It's what I was put on the planet to do. It's what I am here to do. I have to dance." And he stares at her. "Come around tomorrow morning," he says. And then her career begins. It's a wonderful moment because you do realize that for some people, lucky people, there is this imperative, this absolute need to do something. You just know it's what you have to do. And it almost doesn't matter whether or not anybody's going to pay you to do it. You have to do it. Now, in the case of ballet dancing, it sort of does matter that someone's going to pay you to do it, because doing it on your own is a little tiresome and a little peculiar, and it draws attention from quite the wrong sort of people, I would imagine. But in my case, it was writing. It was something I had to do. And one of the reasons I had to do it was the second W of my WWW. The third, actually, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. I think I was about 11 when I saw, talking of English films, I saw Puffin Asquith, as he was known. I saw his version of The Importance of Being Earnest. The first time I'd ever seen the play had Dame Edith Evans and Michael Redgrave and Michael Dennis and Miles Malleson, Margaret Rutherford, an extraordinary cast, and Joan Greenwood and Dorothy Tewton. And I remember Michael Dennison as Algernon saying to Dorothy